Good evening. I'm teaching tonight. Racist. Is that all right?
Yeah, good.
Because I can't raise it up. So I asked Daniel how you make a PowerPoint, and he thought I was joking. And I messaged him and said, "How do you make a PowerPoint?" And he said, "I don't know. How do you?" I'm not blaming him. So I actually looked it up, and then I just need to stop with technology. I tried to print this, so I got to read it off of my phone tonight. I couldn't even print it right. It showed up with a bunch of, all the passages on the page showed up with a bunch of symbols and signs. But the paragraphs that I have written down showed up perfectly. Anyway, I got to read it off my phone. So apologies. I wrote something down. It's a comparison, I suppose, of Jesus and a historical event in 1530. Well, it started in 1535 to 1536, and I thought it was pretty interesting because it's three individuals in Munster, Germany, and they convinced an entire city to revolt. And this is roughly 1,500 years after Jesus' death. But the punishments that they gave to Jesus, that the Roman government dictated at the time, only got worse. And this is a document of that. And I thought it was really interesting of how these guys handled their punishment as opposed to what we have written about Jesus in the Bible of his punishment. So the first passage is in Acts 5:38 through 39. It reads, "So in the present case, I tell you, keep away from these men and let them alone. For if this," sorry, I'm trying to bounce around with this phone. "For if this plan or this undertaking is of man, it will fail. But if it is of God, you will not be able to overthrow them. You might even be found opposing God." So they took his advice. So to the comparison, on January 22nd, 1536, a movement called the Anabaptists, there was a leader named John Van Leyden, and his top two lieutenants, Bernard, sorry about these names, Knipperdoling and Bernard Krechting, were taken into the city center of Munster, Germany, to be publicly executed according to the Roman Catholic standards of that time. And again, they had 1,500 years to perfect torture, essentially. These three men were guilty of waging war against the Roman government by convincing the citizens of Munster to revolt. And how did they do this is really interesting. They pretended to speak directly with God. They convinced an entire city that they were the only three men that God was speaking directly to. And I encourage you to look this up just out of historical interest, but they manipulated an entire community, and I think it was 10 to 15,000 people, and had them doing all sorts of craziness. So they convinced the city to barricade themselves internally against the Romans. And in order to maintain control, these three yahoos convinced the citizens to do, unspeakable things to one another. Finally, it lasted, I think, somewhere around 6 months. There was starvation. It was cannibalism. It was horrible. But the Romans did get in, and more calamity ensued. So with the guise that God was speaking directly to these three men and giving the instructions of specific things to do to specific people, and then they would dictate those orders out to the citizens. That reminds me of Matthew 24, and we were studying this Wednesday night too. And it reads, Matthew 24:11, "And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray," which is certainly not, this is not the first time that's happened since. So accounts of their execution state that the men were terrified and begged forgiveness while being dragged to the city center. They were blaming one another, and they were placed on an elevated stage in the middle of the city center. I imagine like the gallows of the Old West. their backs, there was a pole placed in the middle of the stage, and each man had a spike collar facing inward around their neck, and they were all lined up back to back around the circumference of this pole by design, so that once the torture started with one of the individuals, the other two would hear what was happening but not be able to see it, which furthered their torment. Sorry, I'm trying to catch my place on this tiny little print. The torture was gruesome. It involved red-hot tongs applied to the underarms. That was step one. And I thought about this when I wrote it down. Owen and I have a daily ritual. I pinch him when he wakes up. Give him a pinch. But before he goes to bed, he gets to give me a pinch. One of the places he tries to pinch me, and I've made it off limits, is under the arm. And I can't imagine a red-hot poker going under. I don't even want to pinch under there. Anyway, that's where it started. Red-hot pokers, they removed flesh. They were literally skinned alive. Body parts were removed. Intestines that should be intestines were out-testines. It was gruesome. There was a mandate by the Romans that torture lasted an hour of consciousness. So when a man passed out, the clock stopped. He regained consciousness, the clock started. Accounts vary on the duration that each man endured. While Van Leyden, the main leader, was screaming in pain, another one that was still on the pole, Nipperdolling, he attempted to choke himself to avoid the torture, and they discovered what he was doing, so they further restrained him to keep him upright and alive until it was his turn. He was, of course, all three men suffered the same execution. And Daniel said something else this morning, and I took a note of it, that I don't believe that these three that convinced everybody that they were talking to God for a moment had the mindset that it was a light and momentary affliction. They didn't have anything to look forward to. They knew good and well they were guilty. They were drugged there against their will. They were confessing and apologizing. It really is an interesting read. So 3 men tortured for an hour each. For their own actions, they begged not to be punished. They professed how sorry they were. They attempted to evade capture. And guilty, they were still unwilling to accept responsibility for themselves, much less for ordering the citizens of the community to do these things to each other. Their bodies were placed in cages, and they were hung from the steeple of St. Lambert's Church. And apparently the cages are still there. You can look it up online at this gigantic St. Luke's or St. Lambert's Church in Munster. They removed the cages a long time ago, but the bones from the cages a long time ago, but they hung there and they're still there. So the comparison, different outcome, I thought this was really interesting. Jesus, being innocent, he prayed while awaiting capture and torture that he knew was imminent. Matthew 26 and 39, and going a little farther, he fell on his face and prayed, saying, "My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." Unselfishly, he knew what was happening, or what was going to happen. He didn't attempt evasion, he shouldered it. Matthew 26 and 50, Jesus said to them, "Friend, do what you have come to do." And they came and laid hands on him and seized him. He even healed one of his captors. The account in Luke 22, 50 through 51, and one of them struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his right ear. But Jesus said, "No more of this." He actually stopped the behavior. What anybody would do, I think, in that situation, which would be to try and fight to help your friend, he made them stop and healed the man that was hurt. And he touched his ear and he healed him. Jesus, too, was brutally tortured, and Caleb did a great job a few weeks back detailing what the Roman flogging really was. And in Isaiah 52 and 14, as many were astonished at you, his appearance was so marred beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of the children of mankind. Another comparison, Jesus too begged forgiveness, not selfishly, but he was begging for, or not begging, but he was asking forgiveness for those who were torturing him. Luke 22:34, Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And they cast lots to divide his garments. Another account in Philippians 2:8, and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient, even to the point of death on a cross. Which is really saying something when you take into account those three knuckleheads that were tortured for actual crimes. And you look at what Jesus took on and shouldered for, okay, it was a crime against the government at the time, but like Daniel said this morning, of what side of right or wrong do we stand? So knowing he was innocent, and he still shouldered that. If you look at it in the mindset of mankind in that human form, that's impressive to me. There was no time limit of an hour to Jesus' torture. Mark 15:25, and it was the third hour when they crucified him, which is around 9 a.m. Spikes were driven through his hands and feet. Mark 15:33 through 34. Sorry if I'm going too fast. I'm just reading these off as I go. And when the 6th hour had come, which is about noon, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour, about 3 p.m. And at the 9th hour, Jesus called out with a loud voice, I don't know how to pronounce this, Eli, what is it? Eloi Lema Sabachthani? Which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? So he hung on a wooden beam, his body suspended with spikes, for 6 hours. We don't know if there was unconsciousness or not, but 6 hours is a lot longer than 1 hour. And this is after the flogging, which certainly had a lot of physical pain attached to that. And I remember that when I was a kid, the Bibles that the congregation had where I grew up, at the front page, I tried to find a picture of it too, but I'm terrible with technology and I couldn't do a PowerPoint. But the picture of the Bibles when I was a kid, it had a picture of a pretty fit guy hanging on the cross, just looked like he was relaxing. And I don't think that does justice to the real depiction of what his body would have looked like and gone through. You know, there's a little trickle of blood. You guys have seen that picture before. There's a crown of thorns on it. But I think there was stuff missing that should have been there. And a lot of pain attached with that as well. And a few punches also, wasn't it? A flogging is a flogging. So the other three men in Munster, 1,500 years later, again, 10 to 15,000 people believed that these men were talking directly to God. And yet, like the first verse I read in Acts, I'll read it again. So in the present case, I can tell you, keep away from these men and let them alone. For if this is the plan, or if this plan or this undertaking is of man, it will fail. But if it is of God, you will not be able to overthrow them. You might even be found opposing God. And 10 to 15,000 people believed that those other three were talking to God. But today, in comparison, we don't pray or we don't worship John Van Leyden, and for that matter, countless others, David Koresh, Charles Manson, King Herod, Nebuchadnezzar. How many other people have said, I've got a really cool new idea, but it's of man and it will fail. And in closing, I know this is short, Jesus' death was for all of us, everybody. He could have called an army of angels. He could have chosen not to become the sacrifice for us, to take that punishment for us, for eternity. And we'd be without any hope, without any option of forgiveness. But he did, and it is available. And if there's anybody tonight visiting, you can certainly inquire within. Thank you.